Good afternoon to UK listeners and welcome to the APM People SIGs and Stakeholder Engagement Focus Groups webinar this afternoon. So my name is Benedict Pinches. I am a program management contractor from 20 years standing, and I went back to university in my later years and studied a master's at Oxford University and became interested in the research side as well as the practical side of program management. Since then, I have split my time between practical engagements and consultancy and some teaching and some research as well. So I have quite a varied portfolio career. If you want to see what I look like, the picture that you'll see on your screen at the moment has me at the far left in the blue top. But I didn't choose this picture because it's a particularly flattering picture of me, because I don't think it is. But I chose it for another reason altogether. I really wanted to start the webinar this afternoon with something that signaled some engagement and actually encapsulated that. And this is a picture of me with my family and friends completing a Spartan race, which is quite a tough obstacle course event. And the last bit of that particular race is jumping over quite a large fiery pit, which you can't see because it's just below the edge of the photograph. And the reason why we are all looking the way we are is because we are fully engaged in making sure that we don't actually fall into the fiery pit and get burnt and get hurt. And I think it's a good visual symbol of what engagement actually looks like and what that kind of focus looks like. So let's just have a look at that word engagement and think about what it actually means. Because if you look it up in the dictionary, engagement can mean a number of different things. You have an engagement such as a wedding engagement or an arrangement to meet or be present at a specified place and time. Engagement can also be a job or a period of employment, or it can be a hostile encounter between two different military forces. None of those definitions are what we're referring to within the project context. So within the project context, we are looking at engagement as being emotional involvement or commitment. And as I said, that's what I think this picture symbolizes. So we are trying within a project context to move people from knowing things to feeling things and then actually doing something about it. In the same way that this particular Spartan race, we started off knowing what it involved, and then we felt what it involved when we were actually in it, and then we were actually doing it and actually jumping over that fiery pit. So projects, we all know, are a set of coordinated activities taking place over a certain time frame and delivering a desired outcome. And it's that desired outcome that is important for the stakeholder section, because it's the stakeholders that actually determine what that outcome is. So today, in today's webinar, I'm going to briefly talk about what stakeholder engagement is, and then I'm going to list a number of reasons why I believe it's absolutely critical to successful project management. So if we look at the definition of project stakeholders, we've just had a quick look at the engagement definition. And if we look at project stakeholder definition, here are two very well-known ones that I'm sure you will all be familiar with. So the PMI one first talks about a person or organization that is actively involved in the project, whose interests may be positively or negatively affected either by the work of the project or the outputs from the project, and who may exert influence over the project or its deliverables. So that's quite a full definition, sounds almost legalistic. The APM's one is shorter and more succinct, but it still contains those key words which I've highlighted, which are involved, and affected. So the APM definition I tend to prefer, without showing too much bias, simply because it is that bit more engaging. Now, both of these definitions came about at the time of the respective production of the books of knowledge, both PMI and APM, which is roughly in the 1990s period. But actually, the definition of stakeholder goes back further than that and leads us to the work of Ed Freeman, who is really the father of stakeholder research. And he defines the stakeholder in a very, an even more succinct way, as he says, a stakeholder is any group or individual who can affect or is affected by the achievement of a corporation's purpose. Now, I really like this definition because it's so succinct and so neat. But obviously, Ed Freeman was talking about corporations, and we need to change that really to talk about a project, to be project specific. So when we talk about a project's purpose, we talk about the vision and the outcomes of that project, and stakeholders then are any individual or group who can affect or are affected by that vision or those outcomes. Now, there are schools of thought of people who think that actually the definition can be wider than this. For me, I'm happy to keep it at this kind of level, and I think it's a really useful thing to come back to when we're thinking about stakeholder engagement. What has typically happened over the past is when we talk about stakeholder, we think very much about the key shareholder, usually the sponsoring person, in this case the pointy-haired boss that we all know and love. And that has typically been the main area of engagement for stakeholder process. And in fact, we've talked very much in the past about stakeholder management, about managing your stakeholders and managing that whole process. And I think now the time is right to move from that management position to the engagement position. And that's what today is all about, explaining why that engagement position is so important. And we start with a realization and an acknowledgement that projects are not just about the money. So when we're looking at pointy-haired boss and we're looking at the shareholders in this, there is a financial return required. There are budgetary constraints. But actually, if you think about the projects you deliver, especially the projects now in the 21st century, there are many more benefits to your projects, and there's many more areas than just the financial. So sure, we have the economic drivers and we have the economic benefits, but there are also social benefits. There are many benefits, certainly in construction work now, that are wrapped up in health and safety and in doing jobs well. There are the environmental impacts, which are becoming ever more important, and there's the ethical side as well. Is there a benefit from the project, from your ethical relationship with your suppliers and your contractors? There's also an interesting category of benefits which affect shareholders and stakeholders, which is the whole learning side. So there are projects that can be failures in terms of time, cost and quality, but actually produce great learning for the organization involved. And an example of this project is the Apple company, and the fact their first Mac was a dismal failure and the whole company nearly went bankrupt. But actually from that project and from that initial launch, they learned a huge amount to be able to produce the second and hugely popular Apple Mac, which we all know and love today. So why are we talking about benefits? Because, as I say, it's the stakeholders that actually define the benefits. The benefits affect the engagement of the various stakeholders in your project. And the stakeholders at the beginning that you identify, that you go through the process of identifying the stakeholders, and it's a difficult thing to do. Let's not put any let's not make any bones about it. It's extremely hard to identify stakeholders at the beginning of your project. Often some of the stakeholders may show themselves later on in the project. They may not be initially engaged. They may not realize that they're actually affected, and you may not. Equally, some stakeholders may not know what they want initially. They may change their mind midway through. We have situations which happen a lot where projects take periods of years, and within that project and within that stakeholder community, people change jobs. So what was an extremely engaged and interested stakeholder becomes somebody who's actually not affected by the project at all. And in some cases, we have people who are only involved in one tiny aspect of the project, but they're very involved at that particular point. So the whole identification process for stakeholders is difficult, and it's made even more difficult by the idea of time marching on with ideas and events actually changing and affecting those deliverables. And I think anybody who's worked on a change project will know what I mean and what Peter Checkland talks about when he talks about flux, which is that diagram over to the left. Equally, Schopenhauer has said, that actually the aims and what we set out to do, which is that lovely horizontal line on the right-hand side, is twisted and distorted by fortune and pulled over to the right-hand side. So what you end up achieving and what you end up delivering is actually different from what perhaps you set out to initially. And I think it's interesting that project management has just been determined to be a social science. It's something that actually came out this year, that the project management has been accepted into the body of social science from an academic point of view. And I think this is quite significant because whereas something like economics, Bertrand Russell said actually that economics explain how people make their choices, and sociology explains that people cannot make choices. So we're in quite a difficult position here if we agree with what Bertrand Russell says. We've got a shifting mass of stakeholders. We've got events and ideas that are changing that, and then we've got good fortune as well that comes in. And all of that, I think, just backs up Daniel Kahneman's point, which is the planning fallacy. You make a plan, it's usually a best case scenario. Then you assume that the outcome will follow your plan, even when you should know better. So stakeholder identification is difficult, and it's made more difficult because actually, as project manager, you are much more of a conductor than a solo instrumentalist. So conductors, when they're conducting a piece of music, they need to listen to all the instruments together. And in fact, there's a very neat academic paper that's been written by a Russian philosopher, which actually talks about polyphony within stakeholders. And polyphony means listening to more than one musical melody at the same time. And this is quite an art, to be able to listen to a wide range of melodies simultaneously and actually determine from that what the overall piece of music sounds like and where it's going. And as I say, this is quite an art within a project, within project management. If you think of an example such as a large construction site in the East End of London, for instance, building a skyscraper there, just some of the stakeholders that will be singing different melodies and for whom you will need to respond to: the board, the people that are investing, the contractors, the subcontractors, then the residents that are nearby, all of whom are affected and have a direct influence on your project, but all of them have very different songs to sing. And your job as project manager is to actually determine what the overall melody is. And that's why it's extremely important to engage with stakeholders. Another example, out of the box. So this lovely phrase came to us from the 1960s and has been used incessantly for workshops and to increase creativity and innovation. People are always saying we need to think out of the box, we need to think of things in a different way. So, okay, if we look at the starting points for change and for change management, I think there are four starting points, and there are four boxes, if you like, and four solid things that we need to bear in mind. The first one is, where are we? Where are these things? The second one is, when do these things happen? The third one is, why do these things happen? And the fourth one is, what is true and false here? All of those are boxes that have traditionally been used as good and useful starting points for change. But I would argue that now there are really no boxes, that all of those dimensions have actually been broken. If you think about the question, where are things? That's a spatial question. And with the advent of cyberspace and the fact that we all spend so much time in the virtual world, that space box has kind of disappeared. Similarly, the when do things happen, the time box, we now have global travel, we have instant real-time access to all kinds of things all over the world. And that time dimension is not so relevant either now. Everybody talks about complexity, the increase in complexity, and I think that's a direct impact on why do things happen. There are so many different factors now, and I'll come to the reason for that in a minute, that actually things are incredibly complex, and the box of causality is broken. And similarly, even the question, what is true and false, is a box that we can't rely on anymore. There's virtual reality, there's CGI, there's all kinds of special effects. People talk about fake news, about fabricated photographs, etc. And it becomes harder and harder to actually identify what is true and what is false. So what does all of this have to do with stakeholder engagement, you're probably thinking? Well, I think the fact that there is no box, that the thinking out of the box idea is finished, means that there is incredibly more stakeholders. There's many more people that you need to consider, and there's also arguably more engagement. Now, I think it's important at this point to make the point that we shouldn't all just sort of throw our hands in the air and go, oh, it's all too difficult, stakeholder engagement, there's so many different people to consider. You don't have to engage with all your stakeholders. Stakeholder engagement is important, but you don't have to engage with all of them. But you do have to be mindful regarding the people that you choose to engage with and how you will measure that engagement. That is important. So be mindful when you have identified your stakeholders, who you are going to engage with, why you're going to engage with them, and how you're going to measure it. And be equally mindful that there are stakeholders that you are going to choose not to engage with, and the reasons for that lack of engagement too. So we live in an organizational in a world where the whole idea of organizations is changing and has been changing for a number of years. This diagram has been taken from some work that Frederic Laloux has done, which is a great book called Reinventing Organizations, which I've put down there at the bottom of the slide. And this book basically looks at organizational development from the beginning of time, if you like, the beginning of man through to now. And you'll see from that, you know, thousands of years ago, organizations were very much smaller, looking at small tribes based around ritual and based around the self as being the center of the universe. And that was the sort of magic idea. And then we moved forward into a more impulsive phase where there were lots of chiefdoms, there was lots of aggression, lots of fighting, and lots of focus on the present moment. The conformist period of organizations lasted, became next, and actually still continues now, with that whole cause and effect, the whole linear timeline idea, and the idea of emerging civilizations and religions. And as I say, that idea of organization still exists today, as does the next one, the achievement, which is more about sort of 20th century businesses. You know, more is better. The universe is a complex clockwork construction, and with you know, hard work and application and focus and everything else, we can unlock that clockwork and actually see how to improve things and actually get achieve more and get more for our organization. And then in the 1960s, there was this more pluralistic idea where all perspectives deserve equal respect. So we started recognizing that actually there were different ideas. And as I say, that the previous ideas of organization still continued while the pluralistic ideas came in. Now we're in a new phase where there is much more focus on self-management and living systems and life being more of a journey. And I think it's easy if you're working in a more traditional industry to think this hasn't actually happened yet. But in fact, there are thousands of companies now that are working and operating in a self-management way, and actually being very, very successful at doing it. And an example of that is a healthcare organization in the Netherlands called Buurtzorg. And Buurtzorg has 7,000 employees. They're all self-managing. They provide holistic care to patients. And the patient satisfaction rate is the highest of any healthcare organization in Europe. They have extremely high levels of staff commitment. They have extremely high levels of staff contentedness. And they're exporting that model now, as we speak, to England and Ireland and various other places in Europe. So this isn't myth. This is reality. And with self-management, that has a direct effect clearly on engagement, because what we're seeing is more and more people being able to access more and more knowledge. The universal access to knowledge, that's escalating this journey and escalating this evolution. And Ray Kurzweil, actually from Google, the director of engineering, talks about if this current rate of progress continues, then the 21st century will be like 20,000 years of progress packed into 100 years. So pretty fast-paced stuff. And another reason why stakeholder engagement is important. So this other reason, which I think is a fundamental reason, is these three giant forces, which Thomas Friedman talks about. So I like to think of it as a complexity rope, because each of these giant forces actually impacts and affects the other, and they actually wind each other up tighter and tighter. So we have the technology technology area. So with Moore's law, which we all know about, with technology doubling and getting faster and faster, and we are now pretty much in a position where one person could actually affect the future of the whole globe, and that's quite a frightening position to be in from a technology perspective. At the same time, we've got a very interconnected market. We've got global transactions that are happening all the time, and we have examples such as the crash in 2008, which was caused by a lot of that interconnectedness. The Harvard Business Review recently conducted a study on complexity across 1,500 CEOs. And 80% of those CEOs who were interviewed were confirmed that they felt that complexity in their area would grow. Unfortunately, less than 50% of them felt prepared to deal with that complexity. So that's a concern. And the third giant force is Mother Nature, which we know is doing its own thing without really being tamed by human beings. We have CO2 emissions with nitrous oxide, got problems with methane, huge plastic problems, tropical forest loss, population explosion, water, etc. So all of these things combined with the advances and rapidly advancing technology and the interconnectedness with the market is making the world a much more complex place, and we react to this, and I think we react by trying to do things faster and faster. And that we need to, when we're doing projects, we need to actually acknowledge this and think about how stakeholders actually can focus on what it is that we're doing and engage them properly and engage their focus when it's being stretched over a large amount of other activities. So another reason why stakeholder engagement is important is because actually many of the risks that you'll have in your risk log can be traced back directly to stakeholder engagement or lack thereof. And this Dilbert cartoon very nicely points that out. If you think of the risks that are in your risk log that relate to internal politics, that relate to hostilities, personal hostilities across people, and communications issues, you'll find that actually quite a lot of those are present. And I would argue that improving stakeholder engagement and focusing on that more will actually de-risk a lot of the risks in your risk log. We notice in the 21st century that there is a rise of a newly termed type of project called mega projects. And the definition of mega projects is very large projects with huge budgets, vast complexity, and a long-lasting impact. And that impact will be on the economy, but it will also be on the environment, potentially, and on society. So we're talking about building huge dams or enormous road infrastructure systems. And these mega projects are not sort of mythical beasts. They are increasing at a dramatic rate, especially in China and the Middle East. And the reason that they're increasing at a rapid rate is because of the availability of labor, the fact that resources historically are now quite cheap, and there is a slack in the global supply chains. So mega projects are on the rise. We're seeing more of them, and we're seeing more investment in them. And what do mega projects mean to stakeholder engagement? Well, again, we have a situation where there are many more stakeholders, and this is just an example that I use of a mega project and some sort of headline figures of stakeholders, groups of stakeholders, all of which I'm sure you will acknowledge will have different agendas and will need to be engaged in different ways in order to actually bring about a successful project. And that, I think, is what we all want. We're all looking to deliver great projects. That's ultimately our driver. And I think if we're going to want to deliver great projects, it can be useful to actually look at the research as well as the practical. So there's a very good study out there where a number of projects, 400 I think in all across multiple sectors, were reviewed for their greatness, if you like, and these projects were projects from the 1950s up to the present day. And following that, there was a qualitative review with 5 CEOs who scored these projects on a 7-point scale. And it was found that great projects have seven common characteristics, which I've got on the slide here. This is the research done by Shareholders, and I've put the link at the bottom for people that are interested and would like to find out more about this great piece of research. So the 7 common characteristics across these great projects that were found, all of them, to me, involve stakeholder engagement and therefore add weight to the argument of the importance of stakeholder engagement. So we look at the first one, involves creating a unique competitive advantage and/or exceptional value for its stakeholders. So yes, of course, that would make your project great, but it's absolutely to do with engagement. The second one, the great projects begin with a long period of project definition dedicated to defining a powerful vision and clear need. And that project definition period needs to involve stakeholder identification, engagement, and the identification of benefits resulting from those stakeholders. The third one creates a revolutionary project culture. Well, you can't create a revolutionary project culture without engaging in a very, very dramatic way with your team and with your organization. Great projects, the fourth one, the great projects need a highly qualified project leader, unconditionally supported by top management. Well, unconditional support is engagement of the highest order. The fifth one maximizes use of existing knowledge, often in cooperation with outside organizations. So working with other organizations and in partnership with them, there's that engagement factor again. Sixth one, integrated development teams. I don't need to go any further with that, integration and engagement there. And the seventh one, great projects have a strong sense of partnership and pride. So that, to me, is all about direct engagement. You don't get pride and partnership and these kind of emotions coming from projects that do not have good stakeholder engagement. And I've seen this personally in the work that I have done with the APM. So many of the events that I have been involved in over the last sort of 10 years, I've seen the ones that are focusing on stakeholders getting many, many more attendees than the numbers for perhaps more technical areas. And I think this is because there is a real hunger to find out more about this side of project management. And it's not just events. It's not just events that we see this at. So with the Stakeholder Engagement Focus Group, we have some web pages that are hosted as part of the APM site. And if you look here at these two graphs, the one on the left is from last year. So in May last year, we had nearly 5,500 hits on our stakeholder pages. This year, that's increased to more than 12,000 hits. So this is a huge hit rate for a web page on the APM, and it really signifies, I think, the the hunger out there for information and for more clarity on this issue. And in fact, I'm really proud to say that our stakeholder engagement web pages are actually top in the Google search. So if you go to Google now and you were to type in stakeholder engagement, the top line that you would see would be the APM stakeholder pages, which is a fantastic position to be in. So another reason for emphasizing the importance of stakeholder engagement is the whole idea of collective intelligence. So we've all heard the expression, 2 heads are better than 1. And in many cases, this is factually true. There are problems, there are wicked problems and complex issues that can only be resolved by collective thinking rather than individual thinking. And I know a chap called Michael Silverman who's done quite a lot of work on this. He's got a product called Crowderscope, and Crowderscope actually does that very thing. It actually gathers collective views from multiple parties and actually synchronizes that and presents it in graphical form as a possible trigger for a solution to an issue. And I think, you know, we need to acknowledge that we can't get this kind of collective intelligence without proper engagement, without actually dragging the right people into the room, and without getting that diversity that we hear so much about in modern business. And then, of course, there's the whole idea of why are we doing projects in the first place? What is it about our work? We don't just do them for the sake of it. And again, a colleague in Canada called Cloud Edmund, he's done a lot of work on the motivations and the reason for projects, and he does warm-up exercises with people that he runs workshops with, asking them to draw why they do projects and actually drill down into that position. And the interesting thing about it, which will come as no surprise really to those of us that are involved, is that most of the time, most of the projects that we do, you know, we're trying to create a better place. We're trying to produce some kind of feeling of happiness across a community or a group or an organization that actually improves things, that make things better. And that big why there gives project managers a quite large responsibility, because if what we're doing is actually trying to make the world a better place and trying to improve situations and improve transport and improve networks and things like that, then actually these things really matter a huge amount. And the stakeholders that we have around us, that we have involved in our projects, are actually looking to us to actually show them a path and show them a vision that they can relate to. And I think that responsibility is really important, and I think we bear it. We should think about the responsibility that we have in that area. And I'd like to end the talk and allow some time for questions at the end by thinking a little bit about that duty of care that project managers have to their stakeholders, and the reason there underlies that for stakeholder engagement. So this is a picture of some Gurkhas leaving battle in Second World War, and you can see that one of them is carrying another one who's obviously injured. He's obviously been injured in battle. And the reason I chose this picture to end the talk with is because I was influenced by a speaker that I heard talking about some research that they were doing on courage and how he had spoken to a lot of extremely brave and courageous soldiers and people out in the field. And there was one man in particular who had done great deeds and risked his own life to save his officer's life. And when asked by this researcher, well, why did you, what made you do it in that moment? What made you actually completely give yourself to that act? He simply said he'd do it for me, and that trust, the implicit trust there that a lot of people in the military have for their officers and for their leaders, I think is a really good model for project management going forward. Because unfortunately, in the business and political world, a lot of that trust now has eroded, and there is real evidence for that. The Edelman Foundation do a trust research report on an annual basis, which you can look up and download, and that shows that actual people's trust in their leaders and people's trust in what they read and everything else is gradually being eroded, and we really need to return to that kind of military type trust, where people are actually helping and doing for each other what they would want done for them. So that's the final reason really why I think stakeholder engagement is important. I hope that you've enjoyed this webinar. My details can be found there on the screen, and please, if you are interested, I would welcome emails from you or comments on my Twitter feed. And there is also a white paper that accompanies this webinar that is available now on the APM website, and you can access it via that link at the bottom of the page there. So either make a note of it now, or you can return to it when the slides are shared at a later point. So it's 1:15 now. I am going to finish at 1:30, but I'll just have a look now at some questions and see what people have been asking. So Katie, the reference for the polyphony is in the white paper. So if you could download it, you'll get that there. Will I give examples of how to measure stakeholder engagement? Yvette, thank you for asking that question. I would like to provide some examples of measuring stakeholder engagement. This talk today was specifically about why it's important, and I think the how is a whole other thing, but it is definitely something that we will be going on to do, and I would hope to be doing a future webinar on that topic. The Buurtzorg healthcare. So we have a question from Peter Duxbury. Spelling is B-U-U-R-T-Z-O-R-G, and I'll write this out for you as well, so that you've got that. So Peter, you asked the question about military trust being focused on hierarchical discipline and not collaborative. That's a good point. I don't actually think the discipline is as important as the trust that's built up from the actual working relationship. I don't think a good army works on a basis of fear and fear alone. It works on the trust that is engendered across the different levels of hierarchy. So I would say yes, it's not collaborative in that sense, but it is in my opinion a warmer thing than a discipline thing. So Victoria Butterworth, I'm just seeing if I can read all of the question. Victoria asks, do you think stakeholder engagement is sometimes overlooked, as it can take a long time to define a powerful vision at the start, and sometimes clients want to get on with it? So yes, I do think stakeholder engagement is often overlooked, and I do think the client often has a more dominant voice than the people that will ultimately be using the product that's produced from your project. So that is a good observation, and I would support that. I think tips for encouraging them to invest the time. I think really we have to look at the success rate. So there are an awful lot of examples, case studies, but also quite well documented research that shows that projects that do invest the time in stakeholder identification, in building good communication plans, and in engaging with stakeholders are more likely to be successful. So I think that is worth summarising and presenting at an early stage in your project journey to your sponsor, and see if that can move them to give you the time that you need to actually prepare. Are there any good books? There are many good stakeholder books. Sinping Choi has asked. I will respond with some books, but I'll write them down because it will be easier than keeping everybody on the phone. So Jonathan Bird, you ask, how do you view social media playing out in the stakeholder engagement world? Well, I think social media plays a really important part of modern stakeholder engagement. I think it's a very useful tool for engaging people, and I think that it's more and more important in large projects, especially projects that spread across different geographies. I think there will be, in terms of how I see it playing out, I think there will be more instances of private. I think people are very much more concerned with their data now and the security of that data, and I foresee social media becoming much more security conscious, and actually private and secure social media groups being set up and built especially for specific projects, and where that data and everything that is discussed within that group and shared within that group is actually kept away from everybody else. Mike Gray asks, what is the future for improving stakeholder engagement? I think the future for improving it is really just having the number of people that are interested in spreading the word, and making sure that it's high at the top of people's agenda, and that is happening. Recently at the APM have been researching for the next iteration of the box, so box 7, and they've conducted a large piece of work engaging with people to ask what they think should be dealt with in more detail. And stakeholder engagement was, I think, second or third in terms of priority of that, in terms of numbers of responses. So this is happening, and the interest and the seriousness with which it's taken, I'm pleased to say, is actually improving. We have a question from David Suter. Any tips for prioritising conflicting needs of different stakeholders? So I wish that there were some easy tips. There's nothing that's I would say that's that easy to point to. However, as I said earlier on, I wouldn't expect anybody to engage with everybody, with all stakeholders. What we need to be very careful about is knowing why we are engaging with some and not others. So when we have conflicting needs with different stakeholder groups, the vision of the project and the idea and the benefits that we are driving towards should lead us to that prioritization, and should say, okay, well, actually we are not so concerned with the voices of that particular stakeholder group at this point, which therefore would put them down somewhat in the pecking order, Maybe at a later point that may change, but at the moment we understand their position, but we're not going to get behind them and actually give them exactly what they want. And that's not an easy thing. That's a sort of very much an act of diplomacy. I think and project managers, I think, have to be diplomatic and have to tread that road, I think. Jay Adcock, have you been in a position where a project is required, i.e. a technical refresh of hardware or services, however the key stakeholders do not wish to be identified, to own the requirement, placing the whole burden on the project team? So I think what you're saying here is that the users don't want to actually come up with the requirements for the technical project, and from a stakeholder engagement perspective, I would say that there is a need there to understand what benefits are actually going to be delivered to these people. Yes, I have been in a position where this has happened, and what we did in that position was actually look at selling to the users the benefits of the new system. And in the case that I'm thinking of that springs to mind immediately is a new invoicing system, which to everybody apart from the finance function in that organization, people saw it as an overhead, and why do we have to learn a whole load of new processes? And actually a lot of the project communications were about explaining to people that the new system would free up a lot of their time, would actually be a lot more joined up across the organization, and would therefore give them the ability to focus in areas, for instance, in marketing. They could do more marketing and less invoicing. So that actually became quite a big part of the project, and people were happier then to get involved in that requirement stage and to actually give their views as to what the requirements should be. Yes, so Richard Tomlinson, I think you're backing up what I said, and you are a military person yourself, and you say that as ex-military, it's not the discipline, it's establishing trust and reliance across all the ranks, and I would agree. I would agree with that. I think that's what makes a successful army function, and that's why I wanted to show that that picture of the Gurkhas who are extremely successful in that. I have a question here from Ben McDougall. How can we deal with stakeholders who will be unavoidably negatively impacted by a project? At the moment, we tend to just ignore it or bury our head in the sand. Well, I think you've kind of partially answered your own question. We shouldn't ignore it, and we as I said earlier on, it's important to know the people that are going to be negatively affected. We may never be able to win them round to the project. We may never be able to get their positive engagement, but if we're not able to get their positive engagement, at least if we've done the work to understand what the impact is going to be on them, presumably a negative impact, if we've done that work, then we are at least in a position to be able to give them answers and to be able to provide assurance in some areas, if not all the areas. So it's still worth doing the homework that I talked about at the beginning, rather than burying your head in the sand, if only to streamline that confrontation when it actually comes, because nobody's going to want it to be kind of dragged out and everybody thinking about, oh well, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure what to do at this point. So we're getting near to the end. There are more questions, and I am happy to add written answers to these questions, which I think Maya can send out. But I'll just take a few more before we close for today. Pritam asks, are there any digital platforms to enhance, improve stakeholder engagement? Yes, Pritam, I think there are many digital platforms. There are, Yammer is a very good platform for increasing engagement. I know people use things like Trello. WhatsApp is very prevalent. At Oxford Major Programs, OxMP, my company, we have a product called Pulse. So there are many different things I think that can be used, and more coming about, which is good news, I think, for project managers generally. So I'm going to take two more questions before we close. Sarah Barton says, where unconditional top management support is not in place, is it worth investing time in trying to achieve this first, or accepting it isn't in place and moving on with trying to deliver as best you can? I think we rarely get unconditional top management support. I think it's a wonderful thing to get if you can. I think it's much more likely that there will be some support from top management and from individual members of the board, and perhaps others that are not so on board with your project. And I think the identification of this is a useful first point to saying, okay, so these members of the board are supportive, so I need to, wherever possible, work with them and engage them better, because they are my champions at that level. And I think the stakeholder engagement process actually enables that kind of focus to happen, and allows you to get on with delivering as best you can, which I think is what we all want at the end of the day. Finally, I've got a question here from James Butcher, which I'm going to answer. What are your thoughts about communications in relation to stakeholders? In my experience, they're closely linked by comms, is often neglected or not understood. And I think this is a really good question to end on. Yes, communications is closely related to stakeholder engagement, but please let's remember that its engagement is a two-way process, and it's about more than it contains communications, but it's about more than communications. Because if we go back to that bit at the very beginning and that initial first slide, we remember that it's about an emotional involvement or commitment, and that can be arrived at through a combination of things supported by communications, but it's not communications alone that delivers that. So thank you very much, everybody. I'm conscious that it's just past 1:30. I've really enjoyed talking to you all, and please do reach out to me, and we can continue this conversation. Thank you very much.